The Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that's shaking Westminster to its core. Right now, at this very moment, Keir Starmer's government is collapsing in real time. The highest court in the land has ruled against the government in a decision so devastating, so absolutely catastrophic, that ministers are reportedly considering mass resignations. This isn't a minor legal setback. This isn't a technicality that can be appealed. This is the Supreme Court declaring that Starmer's government has been acting illegally, that policies affecting millions of British people are unlawful, that the Prime Minister and his cabinet have been violating the Constitution and the rule of law. The ruling came down minutes ago, and the political earthquake is already spreading. Government lawyers are in emergency meetings. Cabinet ministers are being summoned to Downing Street. Labour MPs are frantically calling each other, asking what this means for their political futures. Because what the Supreme Court has done is expose this government as fundamentally illegitimate, operating outside the law, implementing policies without proper legal authority, treating the Constitution as an inconvenience to be ignored rather than a framework that must be respected. The justices didn't hold back. The judgment is scathing, page after page, documenting how Starmer's government overstepped its authority, how ministers acted beyond their powers, how policies were implemented without proper legal basis, how parliamentary procedure was circumvented, how democratic safeguards were ignored. This is a constitutional crisis of the highest order. Because if the government has been acting illegally, then every policy, every regulation, every decision made under those illegal powers is now questionable. The implications are staggering. Laws might need to be repealed, regulations might need to be withdrawn, decisions might need to be reversed, and the political fallout is already beginning. Opposition parties are calling for immediate resignations. Constitutional experts are saying this government cannot continue. Legal analysts are discussing whether criminal charges might be appropriate for ministers who knowingly acted beyond their authority. And the British people are discovering that they've been governed illegally, that the people they elected to uphold the law have been breaking it, that the government that's supposed to work within constitutional limits has been treating those limits with contempt. Starmer is facing the worst crisis of his political career. His authority is shattered. His credibility is destroyed. His government is collapsing, and it's all happening right now in real time as the full implications of this Supreme Court ruling become clear. What you're about to discover is exactly what the court ruled and why it's so devastating. The specific findings that expose this government's lawlessness and why Starmer might not survive the week. The case that reached the Supreme Court was brought by a coalition of concerned citizens, legal experts and civil liberties organisations. They challenged the legality of several key government policies, arguing that Starmer's administration had exceeded its constitutional authority. The government fought the case aggressively, spent enormous amounts of taxpayer money on legal fees trying to defend the indefensible. Their lawyers argued that the government had inherent powers to act in the national interest, that emergency situations justified extraordinary measures, that parliamentary sovereignty gave ministers wide discretion. But the Supreme Court rejected every single argument. And the judgment that came down today is absolutely devastating in its clarity and its condemnation of how this government has been operating. The lead judgment, written by the President of the Supreme Court, minces no words. It states clearly that the government has been acting ultra vires, which is legal terminology, meaning beyond their powers. That policies implemented by ministerial decree without proper parliamentary approval are unconstitutional, that the government cannot simply bypass democratic procedures because it finds them inconvenient, that the rule of law applies to everyone, including and especially the Prime Minister and his cabinet. The judgment goes through multiple government policies one by one and declares each of them unlawful. The immigration policies that gave ministers sweeping powers without parliamentary oversight, unlawful. The regulations that restricted civil liberties without proper legal basis, unlawful. The economic measures that were implemented by executive order rather than through proper legislative process. Unlawful. Each finding is backed by meticulous legal reasoning showing exactly how the government overstepped its authority. What makes this so devastating is that the Supreme Court has essentially ruled that Starmer's government has been governing illegally for months, that policies affecting millions of people have no legal foundation, that regulations businesses have been forced to comply with at enormous cost are invalid, that restrictions on civil liberties that people have endured were unconstitutional. The scope of the illegality is breathtaking. This isn't one mistake or one policy that went too far. This is systematic lawlessness. A pattern of behaviour showing that this government believes it's above the law, that it can do whatever it wants without being bound by constitutional constraints or democratic procedures. And now the highest court in the land has said no, has drawn a line, has told Starmer and his ministers that they've gone too far and must face the consequences. The immediate practical implications are enormous. Every regulation made under the unlawful powers must now be reviewed. Businesses that complied with illegal regulations might have grounds to sue for compensation. People whose rights were violated by unconstitutional policies can seek redress. The government will have to go back to Parliament and seek proper authorisation for policies it's already been implementing. And there's no guarantee Parliament will approve those policies now that they've been exposed as illegal. This creates chaos across government. Civil servants don't know which policies they can continue implementing. Ministers don't know which decisions they can make. The entire machinery of government is paralysed because the legal foundation has been pulled out from under it. The political implications are even more serious. Opposition parties are already on their feet in Parliament demanding answers. How did this happen? Who knew the government was acting illegally? Were ministers warned by their legal advisers and chose to ignore them? Did Starmer personally approve policies he knew were unlawful? These questions demand answers, and Starmer has none that won't make things worse. If he claims he didn't know the policies were illegal, he looks incompetent. If he admits he knew or suspected they were illegal, he's admitting to knowingly breaking the law. Either way, his credibility is destroyed. A Prime Minister is supposed to uphold the law, not violate it. And Starmer has been caught doing exactly that. The constitutional experts being interviewed across news channels are using words like unprecedented and crisis. They're pointing out that while governments sometimes lose court cases, this is different. This isn't the Supreme Court disagreeing with a policy choice. This is the Supreme Court ruling that the government has been acting outside the law altogether, that it's been governing illegally. One expert compared it to a referee not just calling a foul, but declaring that one team has been playing a different sport entirely. The rules weren't just bent, they were completely ignored. And that cannot be allowed to stand in a democracy that's supposed to operate under the rule of law. Labour MPs are in shock. Many are reportedly furious that they weren't told about the legal risks. They voted for legislation based on government assurances that everything was proper and legal. Now they discover they were lied to, that the government knew or should have known it was acting unlawfully and pressed ahead anyway. Some MPs are already calling for an emergency party meeting. Others are demanding Starmer address Parliament immediately. And a few are privately discussing whether this is grounds for removing him as leader. Because this level of incompetence or lawlessness cannot be tolerated. It makes every Labour MP complicit in illegal governance. And when voters discover that their elected representatives were part of a government operating outside the law, the electoral consequences will be severe. The timing couldn't be worse for Starmer. He's already dealing with multiple scandals. His approval ratings are in free fall. His own party is divided and restless. And now comes this legal bombshell that undermines everything his government has done. Every policy announcement will now be met with questions about whether it's legal. Every new initiative will be scrutinised for constitutional validity. The government's authority to govern is fundamentally compromised. Because if you can't trust the government to operate within the law, then how can you trust it at all? The social contract between government and governed depends on the government following the rules. And Starmer's government has broken that contract spectacularly. The Supreme Court judgment includes something particularly damaging. A section detailing the evidence that government lawyers and advisers warned ministers that their proposed actions were legally questionable, that concerns were raised internally about constitutional overreach, and that those warnings were ignored or dismissed. This proves that the illegality wasn't accidental, wasn't an honest mistake. Ministers were told they were pushing legal boundaries and chose to do it anyway. They gambled that nobody would challenge them, or that if challenged, they could win in court, or that even if they lost, the court case would come so late that the policies would already be entrenched. They were catastrophically wrong on all counts. And now they face not just political consequences, but potential personal legal liability. Constitutional lawyers are already discussing whether ministers could face legal action personally, whether knowingly implementing illegal policies could constitute misfeasance in public office, whether there are grounds for criminal charges. This is explosive territory. British politics doesn't typically see ministers prosecuted for their actions in office. There's a tradition of political accountability rather than criminal liability. But this situation is so egregious, so blatant, that normal rules might not apply. If ministers knowingly broke the law, then why should they be immune from prosecution just because they hold high office? The law is supposed to apply equally to everyone, and pressure is building for authorities to investigate whether crimes were committed. The financial cost is also staggering. The government will face lawsuits from individuals and businesses harmed by illegal policies. Compensation claims that could run into billions of pounds, all paid by taxpayers who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis. Money that should be going to hospitals and schools and infrastructure will instead go to settling legal claims arising from government lawlessness. The irony is bitter. Starmer campaigned on competence and integrity, promised to restore trust in government, and instead he's delivered chaos and corruption on a scale that will cost taxpayers enormous sums. The international reaction is devastating for Britain's reputation. Foreign media are covering this as evidence of British democratic decline, of a government that doesn't respect the rule of law, of constitutional crisis in a country that's supposed to be a model of stable democracy. Our allies are concerned. Investors are worried. The image of Britain as a safe, predictable place to do business is taking a hit. Because if the government itself doesn't follow the law, then how can anyone have confidence in British legal and political institutions? The damage to soft power and international standing is severe, and it's all self-inflicted, all caused by a government that thought it could act with impunity. Inside Downing Street, the panic is reportedly total. Emergency meetings have been running for hours. Government lawyers are going through every policy, trying to determine what's legally defensible and what needs to be withdrawn immediately. Political advisors are drafting statements and preparing for the worst. Cabinet ministers are being told to cancel external commitments and stay available for crisis talks. The entire government apparatus has ground to a halt while they try to figure out how to respond to this existential threat. And there's no good option. Every possible response creates new problems. Admitting the full scope of illegality invites more lawsuits and political attacks. Trying to minimise it looks dishonest when the Supreme Court judgment is available for everyone to read. Fighting it isn't an option because you can't fight the Supreme Court. Starmer's personal position is now untenable, according to multiple political analysts. A Prime Minister whose government has been ruled to be acting illegally cannot continue in office. The moral authority is gone. The constitutional legitimacy is destroyed. He can try to cling to power, but every day he remains in office damages his party and the country further. The calls for his resignation are growing louder by the hour, not just from opposition parties, but from within Labour itself. Senior party figures are reportedly telling him privately that he needs to go, that the only way to salvage anything from this disaster is for him to resign and let someone else clean up the mess. Whether he'll listen remains to be seen, but the pressure is becoming unbearable. The Supreme Court ruling also has implications for Brexit and sovereignty, because some of the illegal policies involved agreements with the European Union that were made without proper parliamentary approval. The court ruled these agreements have no legal force because the government lacked authority to make them. This means the secret Brexit backsliding that Farage exposed is not just politically toxic, but legally void. Britain is not bound by commitments made illegally by ministers acting beyond their powers. This is actually good news for Brexit supporters. It means the damage can be undone. But it's catastrophic news for Starmer, whose entire European strategy has been declared unlawful and invalid. The opposition is already preparing motions of no confidence, demanding emergency debates, calling for investigations into who knew what and when. Every scandal, every failure, every broken promise is now being viewed through the lens of this Supreme Court ruling. Was it all illegal? Was the entire government operating outside the law? How deep does the rot go? These questions will dominate politics for months or years to come, and Starmer has no answers that will satisfy anyone. The government is collapsing, not just politically, but legally. The foundations have been ruled unsound, and the entire structure is coming down. What happens next is uncertain, but one thing is clear. Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister is ending. Whether he resigns or is forced out, the Supreme Court has delivered a judgment that cannot be survived. The government has been destroyed by its own lawlessness, and British democracy, while damaged, will ultimately be stronger for having institutions willing to hold even the most powerful accountable to the rule of law. The full text of the Supreme Court judgment is now public, and legal experts are going through it with forensic detail. What they're finding is even more damaging than the initial headline suggested. The judgment doesn't just rule that specific policies were unlawful. It questions the entire approach this government has taken to executive power. The justices use language that's unusually strong for judicial writing. They describe the government's actions as showing a troubling disregard for constitutional norms. They note a pattern of behaviour that suggests ministers believed they were not bound by the usual constraints on executive power. They explicitly reject the government's argument that efficiency and expediency can justify bypassing democratic procedures. This is the Supreme Court essentially accusing Starmer's government of authoritarian tendencies, of believing that being elected gives them unlimited power to do whatever they want, however they want. And the court has emphatically stated that's not how British democracy works. One particularly damning section of the judgment deals with ministerial conduct. The court found that ministers made misleading statements to Parliament about the legal basis for their actions, that they represented policies as being on solid legal ground when their own advisers had expressed serious doubts. In parliamentary democracies, misleading Parliament is supposed to be a resignation matter. It's a fundamental breach of ministerial responsibility, yet multiple ministers in Starmer's government have apparently done exactly that. The judgment provides specific examples with dates and quotes. Ministers standing at the dispatch box claiming legal authority they knew was questionable, assuring MPS that proper procedures had been followed when they hadn't. This isn't just illegal governance, this is systematic deception of Parliament itself. The constitutional implications extend beyond this specific government. Legal scholars are pointing out that this judgment will reshape the boundaries of executive power for generations. It establishes clear limits on what governments can do through ministerial decree versus what requires explicit parliamentary authorisation. It strengthens the principle that governments must work within the law, even when they find it constraining. And it sends a message to future governments that constitutional shortcuts will not be tolerated. The Supreme Court has essentially erected guardrails that will be much harder for future administrations to cross. This is good for democracy long term, but it's devastating for Starmer, who thought he could govern without those constraints. The reaction from civil liberties groups has been one of vindication mixed with anger. They've been warning for months that this government was overreaching, that policies were being implemented without proper legal authority, that rights were being violated without constitutional justification. They were dismissed as troublemakers and fearmongers, told they didn't understand the complexities of governance, accused of putting legal technicalities above practical necessity.